So in the previous panel, we discussed how CWED helps shape the new minimum wage research consensus. And now this panel will discuss some of CWED's work that has influenced policymakers. Tell you a little bit about the speakers. First, we will have Ken Jacobs, who is the chair of the Labor Center at the IRLE, and Ken's going to discuss his research on a living wage policy that affected employers and workers located in the San Francisco International Airport. Then we'll have Michael Reich, who, as he's already been introduced, is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley and co-chair of CWED, and he was the director of the IRLE from 2004 to 2015. Michael's going to discuss CWED's current research on a prospective federal $15 minimum wage policy. And then we'll have Claire Montialoux, who is currently a doctoral student in economics at Crest in Paris, and she is visiting Stanford CPR this year. And before that, Claire was a member of the CWED team. And Claire will discuss the prospective studies she's performed with CWED on California's and New York's $15 minimum wage policies. After this panel talks about their research, we're going to have two discussants. First, we'll have Emmanuel Saez. Emmanuel Saez is a professor of economics and director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California, Berkeley. And then we will have Larry Mishel. Larry Mishel is president of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And I'll be keeping time.
Good morning. And I want to thank CWED and Sandra, the IRLE, for putting this conference together. This morning, we've been talking about the effect of mandated wage policy, keep disappearing here. Oh, living wage policies on employment. And I'm going to take us back to some work that Michael and I and Peter Hall did. It was a pre-CWED formation, you know, the same team, but a little earlier on, to talk about some of the impacts and measurement, not just on employment, but also on worker performance and turnover. And then, I'm going to start out a little bit around, so this work is around airports, and this is an environment in which there had been significant contracting out of jobs directly from airlines to these airline service contractors. And as that happened, as you'll see in the research, we find a decline in wages in those areas, and which had led to some concerns about increasing turnover. And that San Francisco, in response, created the San Francisco Quality Standards Program, which was a living wage policy at SFO, went into effect in the beginning of 2000. I'm going to talk about a paper that Living Wages and Economic Performance that Michael, Peter Hall, and I did, looking at what the effects of that law was, and then get into what's happened since then, both in the airport wages and contracting out, the growth of living wage policies at airports, some of the effect of the research that we've done, and what we know from the LIT on further research on wages, turnover, safety, and security, which is what the policy was meant to address. So what we had here was again, just quickly, the Quality Standards Program at San Francisco International Airport, adapted in late 1999, went into effect January 2000. So we're going back to the pre-September 11th, 2001 world, where security screeners were done by contract agencies with wages at or near the minimum wage, which at the time was $5.75 an hour. The turnover rate was near 100% a year. And airport officials at SFO were concerned about the effects of high turnover on safety and security. Airport Director John Martin reported seeing workers sleeping in stairwells between shifts, going between one and another security job at the airport, which they needed to do to meet costs here. And with many of the airport, as we mentioned, the security and airline service jobs contracting out, the airport had no direct relationships with or oversight of these contract agencies. So their concerns were twofold. One, to create that oversight and to address the high turnover rates and the effects of those high turnover rates. And the jobs we're talking about included security screeners, skycaps, baggage handlers, fuelers, customer service agents, airline cleaners, and catering workers. oops, keeps going off here. So again, minimum wage was $5.75 at the time. The wage went up to $9 and then $10 an hour, January 2001. Another $1.25 if a firm didn't provide benefits. Later on, more recently, it was indexed at 50 cents above the city's living wage policy, which itself was indexed. So the 2017 rate is $14.50 an hour for those workers at the airport. And they must comply with San Francisco's Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, which sets minimum health coverage standards. And if they don't meet those standards, then they need to pay $4.50 an hour to the city to cover, or San Francisco City and a county, but to cover health costs for the uninsured. They also need to provide 12 paid days off and 10 unpaid days off. So the study that we did used some previous research that Michael had done to set, and Peter had done to set a baseline. We did an extensive employer survey. We actually had got badge data, again, in the pre-September 11th world, we got badge data for people who had security badges from the database, and so we were able to use that to look at turnover, and as well as a survey of employees. At the time, about 30,000 workers at SFO, about 11,000 of them were earning under $11 an hour, so it's a pretty sizable workforce in one area. And again, as I mentioned, this concern about the association of low pay and inadequate training on service quality. So this gives you a picture of what wages looked like prior to the policy. Again, here you can see the difference between wages on direct airline employees and those airline service contractors. And the policy applied to both, but the bigger bite was in the service contractors. Screeners, again, and skycaps are the lowest, hovering pretty close to the minimum wage, and some of the others were just above it. But as you can see, that's a fairly sizable wage increase for both entry level and average wage in a number of those areas. So overall, about 9,700 workers were affected by the wage increase. The entry-level pay rose about a third. Average worker pay rose, for the affected workers, rose 22%. And we do see the spillover effects as discussed, not just for those workers directly affected, but at some higher wage levels, and among firms that were not covered by the policy, who in that constrained labor market in an airport felt a need to raise wages in order to compete and maintain their workers. Important results here. First, in turnover, we do find a sizable decline. What keeps happening here? A sizable decline in worker turnover. Again, you can see the biggest effect is in the security screeners, where you've got a 69% increase in the entry wage, a 55% increase in the average wage, and turnover falls by 80%. So these were very big, very quick effects. And at the time when we were interviewing HR folks at the airport over what was happening getting this data, one of them commented to me, and this was from one of the security screener companies, that they were actually spending more of their HR time at the Oakland airport that did not have a policy and was much, much smaller than they were at San Francisco because turnover had fallen so much. For the highly affected firms, overall turnover fell a little more than a third. Importantly, we see not just effects on turnover, but also on worker performance. So we looked at a whole set of metrics, and these are employer surveys. Over a third reported improved work performance, close to half improvements in employee morale, reductions in grievances, close to half. So here we're seeing, effects, and even some effects, those smaller on equipment maintenance and equipment damage, but improvements in customer service. But you can see the worst category is much smaller than the increased category. Some pretty good effects of evidence of effects on a wide range of metrics. We also find similar things from our interviews with employees, where they reported that they were working harder at the job. I mean, some of them say things like, prior to the policy, I knew if I could go take off, do something else, and come back, and there would always be a job there, because turnover was so high. Now I have to take the job seriously. So we got some similar things out of the employee surveys as well. The total cost of the policy, we estimated at a little less than $43 million a year, which worked out to about 0.7% of the fare revenue received at SFO in that year. So if we assume that all of that was passed on purely to passengers, and again, not including the savings from lower turnover, but a straight pass-through, that would have worked out to $1.42 per passenger. So these are very, very small costs overall. We are like...
Yeah, sorry, I said roll with it.
Yeah, it's fine. You know. So we're looking at very small costs overall. And when we did look at employment effects, and you couldn't find any evidence, not surprisingly, with a small cost increase based on an airline ticket. So there was no evidence that it had any negative effect on employment. And we even looked at some stuff around labor substitution, and didn't find any real measurable effects. Some other work that Michael did at the same time looked at improvements in safety and security, not at the airport. We didn't have enough data to measure directly in San Francisco, but this used FAA data for the 19 largest airports, found that lower turnover among screeners is associated with high rates of detection of security breaches. So there we're able to, so we have this evidence that higher wages reduce turnover. We've got evidence that higher wages improve worker performance, and we have evidence that turnover is associated with improvements in safety and security. But at this point, there's no direct evidence linking directly how does a wage increase affect safety and security. Gotta move fast. After this, just very quickly, since the time this report came out, we've continued to see outsourcing at the airports. So there's a 10% increase in the share, 10% point increase in share of workers outsourced between 1990 and 2016, with a lot of the action happening in that, some of that continuing to happen after this report came out. At the same time, we're seeing real wages fall. Big drops in particular, we zero in using the OES on particular occupations. You can see in baggage porters and bellhops, the share outsourced between 2002 and 2012 increased by 59%, and while wages fell 45%. And the key thing to understand is that happened overnight. So at SeaTac, you had people who are working for Alaska Airlines as baggage handlers. Those jobs are outsourced. Their wages are cut by around 45%. Overnight for people who have to then reapply for the job working for Menzies. That was the action that sparked the organizing drive at SeaTac that led to the first $15 minimum wage law that was passed in the country. As you can see, there was a bunch of as-living wage laws were being passed in the late 90s, early 2000s, was when the first things happened at airports. A lot of this stuff stopped after 2001, and then really picked up as the fight for 15 was getting going, and SEIU made a new run at doing organizing drives at airports. And I have to say, our research, this research was used in all of these, as the policy debates and discussions were going on. This research was really central to those debates and discussions. Peter Hall and I testified at a number of these airports, either directly or by Skype or written testimony. San Francisco International Airport, then Director John Martin, also wrote testimony in. So this research continued to have a real impact on policy. And the most recent was Los Angeles last week, moved their airport living wage up to $17 an hour, and new training standards as well. So this research has had a long-term impact. Just to say, there's again good research on wages and turnover, and now with this work looking directly at mandated wage increases and turnover, and we start to get more evidence there, effects on productivity and performance of mandated wage increases. And there's more coming out now around safety and security, including an interesting study by the Port of Seattle. It's not an academic study, and there's a lot more work to be done here, but where they really found directly relationship between turnover and and security violations, and that there were much greater number of errors and security violations by newer workers, and then directly related wages to turnover. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes as the SeaTac wage goes up. There's also evidence in some of these other industries. And just to finish out, Now what's happening at SFO, as San Francisco raised its minimum wage, the Quality Standards Program wage has gotten closer and closer to the San Francisco minimum wage. And if nothing is done by next summer, it'll actually be lower than the San Francisco minimum wage because SFO is not in San Francisco, even though it is governed by San Francisco, so it's not covered by the San Francisco minimum wage. This has created a lot of concern among those airline service contractors. And what they're reporting to the airport is that their turnover rates are going up, and they're worried about the effects on safety and security and the liability that comes from that. So it's a little bit of the experiment in reverse and showing that the relative wage matters. As we get closer, they're raising the issues. And so there's a discussion now of increasing the mandated QSP rate at SFO, and the airline service contractors want to see it raised because they have a competition problem if it's not done statutorily in terms of maintaining those contracts, so they want it done by law. And so that's the discussion that's going on right now at SFO, is raising that wage. It'll be over $17 an hour in terms of, it all ties in with other things happening in San Francisco around the living wage policy. But I think it's an important sort of affirmation both that this analysis is understood both by the airport and by the service contractors themselves who are operating in that environment. And so that's, again, an important affirmation. And this research and the work that Michael really built, and then Sylvia and all in terms of the team here, is really having long-lasting effects, both in terms of our theoretical understanding and in terms of practical policy that's being done on the ground around the country.
Okay, so I just want to add to what Ken was saying that after 9/11, we already had, we're in the middle of our survey results, and we had actually a table that showed that the screeners' turnover fell 80% when the minimum wage went overnight from $5.75 to about $10 or $11 an hour. And that report was, because it was right after 9/11, excuse me, was in dozens of newspapers all over the United States, and we got inquiries from DC, and I believe it helped create the Transportation Security Agency, which took the screening function away from the airlines, which were trying to minimize their costs, and it led to TSA screeners getting paid, what was it, 18 or something like that at the time, and turnover went down even further, if that could be imagined. My talk now is about a similar set of papers that we've done, some with Ken, some with Claire and Sylvia and other people, and they are in response to interest generated from policymakers. And for example, we got asked by the city of Los Angeles, first by the mayor, and then we won a contract with the Los Angeles City Council in 2014 to say, well, what would be the prospective effects of a $15 minimum wage? And no one had ever tried to do this before. We then got asked by the city of San Jose, by New York State officials, and so forth. And so we built up a series of papers and expanded our model. Each time the model got more complicated, but I think better. And I want to show you what we've done for the federal $15 minimum wage. But I also want to emphasize that these have been influential. We testified in Los Angeles. We were heavily covered by the LA Times. I was called by the LA Weekly one of the third most powerful person in Los Angeles. Above Eli Broad, who was number 10, and Kamala Harris, who was number 5 at the time. And the people above me were like, well, anyway. And then also around this time, we had been testifying, or I'd been testifying, other people in the U.S. Senate and in the California legislature, and I had discussions with the Republican leadership of the New York State Senate before they voted on their $15 minimum wage to really allow them to do due diligence on what would be the effect of a minimum wage on the cost side for businesses, which nobody had done, and also why employers would be able to absorb it with what I think are relatively small adjustment processes. So up to this point, almost all the literature, 99.9%, was of the kind that we were talking about in the first session, that is, what's the effect of the minimum wage on employment retrospectively? And then the arguments are about what are the right controls to use and so forth. But the literature also, I think, the prospective literature has gone in a different direction, at least the one I've tried to lead, which is don't look at just past employment elasticities, because we're out of sample now. We're looking at minimum wage increases that are going to affect 20 or 30 or 40% of workers, not 6 to 9%. And we don't know from the past studies what will happen. Moreover, there are some effects that might be small at modest minimum wage increases, as we were discussing, as Ben was discussing in the last session, that might become much larger when the minimum wage gets much higher. So let me read to you from, this is from a brand new paper called The Local Aggregate Effects of Minimum Wage Increases by Jonathan Parker at MIT and a couple of people from the Boston Fed. Jonathan Parker is a premier macro consumption researcher in the United States, I think. And he says, the literature has largely overlooked the fact that the level of the minimum wage should, through general equilibrium adjustments, have effects beyond the labor market. Additionally, changes in the minimum wage could also cause fluctuations as local economies adjust to the changed regulations. And he's then particularly looking at the effect on prices of various commodities because of pass-throughs from the wage increase and the effect on local consumption demand, and finding effects that are actually pretty similar to what we've been finding in our prospective studies. So let's see. To turn to the $15 bill, which some people on the Hill have asked us to study, this would be a bill that would raise the minimum wage to 2024. It was a 2017 bill, so I don't know what will happen in the new session, but the timing might get changed a little bit. And excuse me, what I'm going to talk about in the little time I have is the scale of the bill. Generally, to foreshadow, minimum increases in minimum wages to $15 would lead to a $144 billion increase in pay. That's before looking at behavioral adjustments. And that's not including the states like New York and California and others that are going almost to 15 anyway. And that's more than we spend, I believe, on EITC and food stamps and so forth. So when people say, oh, the EITC is a much sharper instrument, it's also a much smaller instrument, you know. So this is, whoops. I guess if I just have to stay active here, is that the, no?
It's random.
What?
It's random.
It's random. That's not good. I don't like random except samples. So what we do is we build a model with a lot of these general equilibrium effects. And it's very easy to consider what the effects would be just simply by reading what the advocates and the critics say. Now, the critics say, well, hours and staffing are going to be cut back. The advocates say, well, and there's going to be automation. And the advocates say, well, people have more purchasing power, and therefore that will generate more jobs. So not necessarily the same jobs that will be cut back by automation. And in the US model here, we also have to think about macro effects that are a little bit different from doing the local studies, which Claire will talk about. And so we build a model with all these effects, and then we calibrate the model at, say, a $9.25 minimum wage, which is in the schedule for the 2017 bill, but is also within sample of previous studies. So we can see if, for example, the labor demand elasticity that we generate from this kind of simulation model is close to what we would expect from the literature itself. And then we make estimates out of sample for $13 in 2021 and $15 in 2024. What we don't do is make estimates of what would happen if the minimum wage were, say, $50 or $150. I will suggest that would result in big negative effects, but we don't really have the kind of data to actually quantify that. So here's the preview. The 30% of U.S. workers will get an increase of 17%. The model recognizes that there are positive and negative effects of minimum wages, and that's important to include both, not just follow what the advocates say or what the critics say, but to unify them into a single model. And for the dynamics, the substitution, which is the automation, basically capital deepening effect, and the scale effects. Scale effect means if prices go up, then the scale of output will go down. Those will keep growing, and those are negative effects. The stimulus effect, because people have more purchasing power, low-income people do, will shrink at very high minimum wages, because you're now looking at wages going to people who are in the middle and even the upper part of the income distribution, where savings rates are a lot higher. So the stimulus to consumption will be lower. And as it turns out, when we look at this, we get results that are very similar to what Jonathan Parker just reports in his new paper. The economy-wide wage bill will increase 1.9%. Employment changes hardly at all. And our labor demand elasticity is 0.005. We don't put any confidence interval around that or something, because I really don't know how to do it. We don't really have the data, but clearly it's very small. And there are other economy-wide benefits. Productivity grows, worker turnover falls, and there are distribution effects, of course. So I would summarize this as consumers actually pay for the minimum wage more than anyone else through slightly higher prices. And consumption is highly skewed upward because people have more income, even though they save a higher part of it, are still doing the bulk of the consumption in the US by the virtue of their having the higher income. This is the schedule. You can see it's phased in over time, a very important feature. And there are different ways to measure this. If you take into account the increases that are already occurring at the state level, and also the important thing is what's the counterfactual, what would happen without the policy, which is our approach. And we use the CBO and other official forecasts for wage and price growth, 2.4% each. There's some opportunity to vary those, but not. But I think how much to vary is hard to say. Anyway, it's actually 5.4% per year is the increase in the wage floor, and the estimated increase in the wage bill is 2%. Here's a diagram of how much we're out of sample, and I'll go faster now. I've already talked about most of this slide. This is the kind of slide that Ben was showing of what would happen before behavioral adjustments. And then the model, we have automation, we have productivity growth for various reasons. And in this paper, we're trying to be more allowing of more productivity growth than our previous papers. For the LA study, we didn't have any automation, for example. And the other state papers, we have allowed some, and here I've gone even further in order to be more conservative, because every increase in productivity means less employment, hurts employment more, basically, even though productivity growth is a good thing. And I look also at some various macro issues, capacity constraints, what the Fed would do in response, and so forth. We assume that prices are going to be passed through under a kind of monopolistic competition model, leaving profits unchanged, but the model doesn't change very much. The results don't change very much when you include a competitive sector and some falling profits, and that's partly because of interactions among the components, because falling profits also would affect consumption demand. Very little labor supply effect, very little substitution of skilled labor for unskilled labor per a number of studies, and no change in composition of output, because we don't know how output composition would change, but that's another important adjustment of margin and general equilibrium models. And this is a flow diagram moving from left to right because I don't have much time. I'll let you read it at your own leisure. But it's trying in a picture to put all these features together. It's not really moving from left to right. These are all happening simultaneously and interactively. But I don't, I'm not good enough to do this, or maybe take 3 dimensions. And as I said, we're going to calibrate the model using CBO and the Fed parameters from both the minimum wage and non-minimum wage literatures. For example, on consumption propensities, automation effect elasticities. This slide gives you the details of what the literature is saying. The elasticity of substitution capital for labor is probably pretty low compared to, 2 minutes, compared to what a lot of people think. And, but it does increase when the industry wage goes up. So we have to take that into account. These are various productivity effects. Since I only have 2 minutes left, I'm not going to go through each one, except, again, we'll post these slides. The scale effect is a lot smaller than you would think, largely because not everyone is getting a minimum wage increase, and because operating cost increases require calculating in the average share of labor costs, which is, say, about 1/3 or less for restaurants, 11% for retail. And then, okay, the consumer spending part basically builds on the fact that different households have different propensities to consume. Lower ones have a higher propensity, lower income has higher propensity to consume. We run through this input-output model plan, and we get an employment elasticity of about 1.1. This works out actually very similar to what Parker is finding in his new paper, and to a grad student at Princeton named Chris Alonso. And capacity constraints, we didn't really have any good way to handle this because nobody knows what full employment is anymore, as our colleague here, Yuri Gornichenko, has shown. So I just take a rough stab at this, and similar interest rates effect is small. Skip all this, the dynamics I've talked about, estimated effects. Labor demand elasticity at 925 is minus 0.06, which is within the range. These are all within the range. They're all really close to 0. What will happen above $15, who knows? But I think and I should also mention that there's some adjustments through business turnover, exits, and entries that I have mentioned. So there are winners and losers, but I think the overall effect is actually pretty mild, even at a federal $15. In the rest of the study, we look at the same thing for Mississippi. And while the effects are a little more negative, they're still very mild. So even a low-wage state like Mississippi could absorb a $15 minimum wage according to this model. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. As Carl said, I just started my dissertation on the minimum wage, and over the last 2 years, I've been working at RLE on this topic, and I just wanted to say how grateful I was to Sylvia Allegretto, Michael Reich, Jesse Rothstein, and others, all the other people I've been working with, because they transmitted their knowledge and excitement about this topic. So thank you for that. And it's also an exciting time to work on this topic in the US. There's a lot of debates happening at the state and local level, and even at the federal level over the last presidential campaign about raising the minimum wage. And just take an example, Berkeley is set to have a minimum wage to $15 next year. And just 2 years ago, there were even discussions at City Berkeley Council to raise the minimum wage to $19 an hour by 2020. So there is a question, which is, what are the effects of substantially higher minimum wages in the US, And I'm trying to bring some answers to this question in my research. And today I'm going to talk about 2 ways to learn about those effects. First, by using a model and calibrating it to simulate $15 minimum wages in states like New York and California. And what I'm going to talk about is based on some work I've been doing at CWED over the last 2 years. And since Michael has focused on the conceptual framework, I'm going to focus on our empirical results for those 2 states. And second, the second way to learn about those effects is to investigate the effects of high minimum wages in the past. So I'm going to present the very early stages of some research I started with Elora de Renoncourt, who's a PhD student at Harvard, and where we look at the big reforms of the 60s in the US. So let's start with New York and California. You already know this picture, but I just wanted to show you the evolution of the inflation-adjusted federal minimum wage over time and the New York State minimum wage increase that is going to happen over the next few years. And you see that if you just look at the inflation-adjusted picture, of course, a $15 minimum wage by 2021 in New York State is going to reach unprecedented levels. In California, you can see that the minimum wage increases that have been recently voted are going to be very similar in their scale to what's happening in New York State. However, the point that I wanted to make is that there's been growth happening over those years. So if you just look at what the minimum wage would be if it had grown with output per hour since 1968, so the high point in the minimum wage, it would be about $20 in real terms today compared to the $13 in real terms by the end of the period in New York State and California. So now let's talk about the empirical results of our study. Our first step in our study is to identify the workers that will be affected by the policy. And here I'm presenting the results of estimation that I've been doing by the Economic Policy Institute for New York. We've been doing the same for California. And we are separating out the workers that are directly affected by the policy, those workers that are earning between the old minimum wage and the new minimum wage level, and those that are indirectly affected. And here we make the assumption that the workers are affected up to 115% of the new minimum wage based on research by Erin in particular. And what you can see is that those big minimum wage increases are going to affect globally up to about 40% of the workforce in New York State and California, and about 50% of the workforce in Fresno County. So that's a really huge bite of those policies. Then the second step in our model is to quantify the employment effects due to 3 channels. The first channel is the employment effects due to capital-labor substitution. The second effect is the employment effect due to the scale effect. And as Michael mentioned, this is the reduction in output due to price increases. And the third effect that we are quantifying are the income effects, which are all the boost in aggregate demand that comes from higher purchasing power for the workers that get those increases. And really, here I'm putting all the key parameters that are using in our model. And the key point that I wanted to make is that we have a value of the capital substitution elasticity that is 0.2 based on our reading of the literature on this point. And this is really the key parameters among the key parameters in our model, because when you change that, this is going to affect all the results we have on the overall employment. Other than that, we are using basically the same assumptions for New York, California, and Fresno County, which is probably one of the poorest county in California. So now let's look at what's happening for workers and the benefits they can get from those minimum wage increases. And the point that I want to highlight here is that those minimum wage increases are going to give substantial increases in their wages, about $4,000 in today's terms, in New York State, in California, and in Fresno County. And this is what we're going to take into account in our model to calculate how this will affect aggregate demand. We are also, as I said now, on the cost side, we are taking into account that firms are going to do, to some extent, some capital labor substitution. But once we've taken those effects into account, we need to understand how firms are going to respond to those minimum wage increases. And there are two ways they could do that. Either they could raise their prices or they could lower the profits. And the assumption that we do in our model is that they are going to raise their prices. And this is based on the evidence that we have so far. There's been very little research on the effect of minimum wages on profits, and the research that we know is mixed. There's mixed evidence on the effect of minimum wages on profits. And the evidence that we have on the prices actually is showing us that there's full pass-through or almost full pass-through in the restaurant industry. And here I'm just showing one graph of the pass-through, the magnitude and the dynamics of the pass-through in grocery stores based on work I'm doing with Tobias Rankin and Michael Siegenthaler in Zurich. And what you can see here is that the price elasticity of the minimum wage increase in grocery stores in the US is about 0.02. We show that this is consistent with the full pass-through. And around the 3 months the legislation is passed, the legislation of the minimum wage increase, you can see that firms are step by step increasing their prices. So this is the assumption that we make for all sectors in the economy in our study. So we generalize the results that we have for the restaurant industry and the grocery stores industry to the rest of the economy. So for New York, you can see how we compute those price increases. We just take the increase in payroll costs and multiply that by the labor share of operating costs in every industry to get our price increases. And what is important to note here is that for our state studies, the assumption that we do is that it's a simplification assumption, but we do the assumption that there's no price increase due to the price increases in intermediary inputs. Because we believe that largely a lot of those intermediary inputs are coming from other states or potentially from other countries that are not affected by the minimum wage increases. And overall, for the New York State, California, and Fresno, we find that for all industries, the price increase would be quite moderate, about 0.7 or 0.8%, a little bit above 1% for Fresno. The second point that is interesting here is, of course, that there's a lot of variation across industries. In particular, you can see that for restaurants, the price increase can get as high as 6 or 7% because the labor share of operating costs in these sectors is high. Now I come to the net effects on employment, so combining again all the three channels that we are looking into, the capital labor substitution, the scale effect, and the income effect. And what you can see is that for New York State and California, according to the model that we've built and all the assumptions that we've made, the positive effects, the negative effects on employment that are coming from the substitution and the scale effect are largely offset by the positive effect that are coming from those aggregate demand effects. And again, if you change the capital labor substitution elasticity, you would get some negative employment effects, but they are still in the range of the previous literature. Next, I'll talk about how we are trying to investigate the effects of high minimum wages in the 60s with Elora Derenoncourt. If you look at the history of the minimum wage, you will see that the Fair Labor Standard Act in 1938 introduced the minimum wage for a certain number of sectors, but a number of them, like agriculture, construction, retail trade, were not covered until the 1961 and 1966 amendments. So our idea is to use a difference in difference estimator to compare the relative wage growth and employment growth in sectors that are newly covered to the sectors that were previously covered before and after, for example, the 1966 amendment. And what we do find so far, we're just looking here at the first stage, so the effect of the extension in coverage in agriculture, in construction on wages. We do find large relative wage growth in agriculture on the left and in construction on the right, relative to a control group that is just the weighting the wages in the industries that are already covered by the minimum wage. And what we are planning to do is to generalize this approach to employment effects in the future. As a conclusion, I'd like to say that based on the model that we've been building and calibrating, what's important to notice is that the positive and negative effects on employment seems to largely offset each other for New York State and California. However, further research is needed, in particular on the effect of minimum wage increases on profits and probably on the path-through of labor cost increases in intermediary inputs. And this is particularly critical for nationwide minimum wage increases. For the effects of high minimum wages in the 60s, we find substantial relative growth in the newly covered sectors versus previously covered sectors. And I look forward to talk more about the next step for this research. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to comment on the modeling the effect of state and federal minimum wages through the CWED model that Michael has presented at the federal level and that Claire talked about in the case of the state. So minimum wage policy is a key policy to help increase low wages. As we've seen, many states and cities have passed large increases in minimum wage in recent years. Democrats would like to sharply increase the federal minimum wage, so it's critical to understand the effects both at the local and federal level of a minimum wage policy. So as we've seen in the first part of this conference, there's a very large empirical literature, but it is challenging to put all the effects together, and that's what you have to do if you want to predict, the effects of the minimum wage on the economy. And so that's what the CWED model does. So it's a thankless type of job because it's a very disparate set of results. The world is complex. The things are not going to be perfect, but you have to do it to inform policymakers because one study is not enough really to understand, one empirical study, the full consequences of the minimum wage. And so the CWED is the most sophisticated attempt to date to predict minimum wage effects. So it is a pragmatic, non-structural model that incorporates most salient empirical findings. So it's well grounded in empirical findings along a number of dimensions. So the first, it uses the direct distribution of wages so that you can see mechanically who is going to gain, how many workers are going to gain, what's the effect on the total wage bill. Then it incorporates substitution effects from low-wage workers. If employers decide to substitute away from low-wage workers, then pass through to prices. As their labor cost increase, the assumption is that the pass-through is going to be essentially fully on prices, and I think that's a reasonable assumption given the recent, very interesting work that Claire has shown, but other work actually from other countries. Attila Lindner has a very interesting study on that in the case of Hungary. And then they find in net the effect of employment of moving to $15, at a 5-year horizon is very close to zero. So I'm going to talk about 4 issues. So it's a great model, but my role as a discussant, is to point out, things that perhaps I didn't fully understand or things, to think for the future. So I'm going to talk about 4 topics: competitive model, labor cost in output, local versus federal, and then the link with what the Congressional Budget Office does on minimum wage. So let me start at the more fundamental level. So the core, really the idea behind this model is to have a core Marshallian competitive model. I think in one of the papers they like to say we follow, the Marshallian, competitive laws of labor demand and consumer demand. So the problem with that is that if really your model is a competitive model, the scope for using a minimum wage over and above, other tools such as taxes and transfers is going to be very limited. So a minimum wage is typically a distortion in the economy, and so we've done some work at a formal level actually with David Lee on that, and Jesse Rothstein, Erin Dubé as well. The scope really for minimum wage is limited. It helps you perhaps if you have an EITC and you want to make sure the EITC is pocketed by the workers and not the employer, through reduced wages. With a minimum wage, they can't really reduce wages, so the EITC goes to the worker. But it's a very narrow point. In reality, people here, if they were asked why do we want a minimum wage, it's because we think that wages are not set just, at the marginal product, because there are lots of matching costs, finding a job, finding an employee, and therefore once a match is formed, there is surplus. They are going, to both the employer and the employee, and the minimum wage is a way to shift the surplus toward workers. So I want to urge, the modelers to think how they can incorporate, at least in the text, perhaps, this industrial relation view into the model, and more broadly, labor economists should think about how to have that type of model, be the core model they use rather than the competitive model. So now let me talk about price effects. So to take one example from a local business, Gregoire, that you might know is a little restaurant, north of campus. When there was the big minimum wage increase that actually has been studied this morning, they put this out, saying, that look, Auckland, Berkeley have passed big increases in minimum wages, and because of that, big increase of 35% starting March 1st, we are going to increase our prices because we have to pay our workers more. So that's a very interesting piece of evidence. Actually, Pascal Mishel is the person who found it, because it shows you that it's not only a surplus, between workers and employers, but there's also a relationship between the customer and the business, and the business and the customers get a surplus out of that, and you have to manage this relationship. And so increasing prices could upset consumers, but if you give a good justification, in liberal Berkeley, it goes to low-wage workers, perhaps you keep the relationship alive or better. So that's, I think, one striking example. So that shows that indeed, in action, businesses passed on the effects on prices. So that brings me to that issue number 2, labor cost in output and price effects. So that's a technical but potentially important issue with the model that I had, at least reading very quickly. So in the model, Claire explained that in the case of the local state level, they say labor costs in operating costs are only 22%. And that means that if my payroll costs increase by 3.35% times 22%, that's going to be a 0.74 price increase. Now, you know that economy-wide, labor income in value added is something like 3/4. The rest, going to capital. And as Claire said, the difference is due to intermediate goods production. That is, Gregoire uses a number of food products, that are processed, in upstream, and then adds value with its workers, and then sells to the final consumers. But now, if you believe there is a minimum wage, increases also the wages of farm workers. In that case, the inputs that Gregoire uses also have a price increase. So the price increase cascades. So in reality, you shouldn't use a 22% here. You should use a 75%. Certainly, if you do it US-wide, it's true that if it's a very local minimum wage, the farms are not in Berkeley or in Auckland, so the price of products do not increase, but whatever Berkeley produces that is an intermediate good will have a price increase that is exported, to other cities. So I'm asking, the modelers to think through that issue. It makes a difference in the sense that instead of getting 0 employment effect, they would get a -1% employment effect if you triple, that effect on prices. Local versus federal minimum wage. So that's related to one thing I said. The key distinction here is between tradable versus non-tradable goods. That is, the things, say, you do a local minimum wage that can, local stuff, like Chez Gregoire cannot really be exported, so it's understandable that you're going to have a price increase right there. But in contrast, if we're producing something that goes countrywide, for export, you can't pass through the price. And so US-wide, a lot fewer things, will be tradable. That is, will be exports, in the foreign countries. But at the local level, the share tradable is going to be much bigger. And I'm not sure the model does that distinction, and that would be an important avenue. So let me finish with my fourth issue, which is the link with Congressional Budget Office analysis. So back in 2014, CBO examined the effects of increasing the federal minimum wage to $9 or $10.1, and their prediction was that a $9 minimum wage would have a zero effect on employment, a 10.1, something like a minus 0.3% on employment. So extrapolating from those two numbers, you can see that a $15 minimum wage, taking into account, that it's going to take place a number of years, would be something probably like -1 instead of 0, as the CWED finds. As we've learned, in the case of healthcare, CBO analysis plays a big role, in informing the public debate. So fast forward, hopefully, 3 years from now, when we are in shape, to increase the minimum wage at the federal level, the CBO numbers that are going to come out are going to play a big role in that debate. CBO analysis is responsive to outside academic research. That is, I work mostly on tax policy and how you do income distribution, incidence of taxes. I've had a dialogue with them and other agencies, so I urge, CWED to also start right now, this dialogue with the method of CBO to make sure there is cross-fertilization and the best ideas, are brought in. Thank you.
So I'm going to be different because I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. So let's get rid of all this stuff. Maybe we'll even just do this. Okay. Shut that stuff down. I'm going to ask everybody to start thinking differently about the minimum wage and how we evaluate its impact. And I guess I'll start, being a DC policy think tank leader, with exactly the conundrum that advocates of a higher minimum wage will face when the CBO does a report on $15. In fact, it won't necessarily be 3 years from now. The Republicans have already asked them to do such an analysis. So we just don't know when, but we do know kind of how they do it. So I think the way they approach things are somewhat are very incomplete, and let me explain this. The conundrum that I think those who think a minimum wage policy, much higher minimum wage is appropriate, has been the following. The great research done by people in this room and outside it has shown that modest increases in the minimum wage have minimal, if any, employment effects. And that has been the mantra of economists on the center left and the advocates around minimum wage increases in state referendum, federal policy for many years appropriately. The problem is that modest increases have been substantially inadequate. Okay, so that has led to a movement to have much bolder increases, the Fight for 15, which, as we kind of say, it takes us out of sample. We have no idea. I mean, other than the prospective research done here, which I salute, we don't really know, in terms of an evaluation of anything that's happened in the past, what will actually happen in terms of employment losses, okay? So that has led me over the last few years to sound an alarm, which is, I think I've been given the floor today to do so here, that we need to shift away from talking about employment losses. And I'm going to say in two ways. One is looking at employment loss as if the minimum wage costs one job, therefore it is bad, is a very narrow framework for thinking about whether the minimum wage is good or not. And secondly, even the concept of employment loss embedded in the studies, prospective or past, is a very misleading characterization of how the low-wage labor market actually works. It's a mischaracterization of the world because it presents a world whether either you are employed or you're not employed forever. But in fact, if you look at what happens over the course of a year, there's a lot of ways that things change when you have a shrinkage of aggregate work hours. A shrinkage of aggregate work hours is really what economics tells us to expect. It does not, we have very little guidance as to how that shrinkage of aggregate work hours is distributed over the course of a year across the workforce in shrinkage of weekly hours, shrinkage of weeks worked, shrinkage of the number of people with multiple jobs. There's a lot of, or people being disemployed forever, right? There's all these different combinations. And employment loss, in fact, and I'll explain, I think exaggerates the negative consequences, the potential negative consequences, and mischaracterizes it. So that's my bottom line. So let's think about the first, is employment loss a sufficient way to evaluate a minimum wage? Obviously not. Claire put up increases for those, New York, California, Fresno. I mean, the average wages went up a ton. The wage pool for low-wage workers went up a ton. According to almost all the estimates, except for some outliers, this recent crazy Seattle study, suggests that when you increase the minimum wage, the wage pool will grow, right? Even if there's less hours worked, right? So that on average, low-wage workers and their communities will benefit. Now, having been the participant in many debates on trade and other things in Washington, I'm aware of no other policy area where if there's one job loss, they say don't do it. I never heard that about NAFTA. I never heard about TPP. I never heard about anything, okay? And you will never hear it about anything except the minimum wage. And we implicitly are accepting that metric. And I understand why. And because it's responding to, the very simple neoclassical economics that we were taught in the Econ 101. There's a downward sloping demand curve. If you raise the wage, employment goes down. That picture involves only two parts of the world. You're either employed or you're not employed, and that's not true. And all of the data, most of the data that is used for the studies is a cross section. So you're only observing people as either employed or not employed. And so, the debate tends to be about an employment effect. And I just want to say we have to shift away from that. We have to be bigger, bolder, broader. And I'll give the example from the CBO as, and I'm drawing on a paper that Ben and Dave Cooper at EPI and are doing, and work that Dale Bellman is doing with the SIP on churn. But take the CBO study. The headline, not necessarily in how you read the executive summary, but the headline that the press focuses on was when they evaluated the $10.10 increase, you put up the numbers, 0.3% loss of employment or something like that. 500,000 jobs lost. But let's look at the actual numbers. They said that there were 25 million workers that were affected by the minimum wage, 16 directly, another 9 or something like 16.5 direct, another 8 million indirectly. And then roughly 25 million workers affected. They said 500,000 job loss. That's 3%. So that, or 2 or 3%. You have like 97% are clearly gainers and 3% are potential losers. The wage pool grew a lot, average wages grew a lot, but the focus was on the job loss. And so that is clearly, a distorted framework for thinking about the value of the minimum wage. As I said, the actual economics is that and let me just say, so to my friends doing the prospective studies, your work is reflecting this kind of framework. And you can't escape the issue of, are low-wage workers going to have fewer jobs, even despite your estimates? Because take Claire's work and Michael and all that. So there's three effects. There's the substitution effect, which solely affects low-wage workers, right? There's a scale effect, which affects workers in the affected industries, but will disproportionately affect low-wage workers because they're disproportionately low-wage industries. And the income distribution respending effect is workers across the board. So the negative effects are going to be disproportionately among the low-wage workers, and the positive effects will be spread out. The net effect is that low-wage workers will probably suffer in these models less employment, and the plus side will be above the low-wage workers, which may be good because you could say low-wage workers are going to move up. But the fact is, that you can't, I think, invoke these models and say low-wage workers will not suffer any decrease in aggregate work hours. But what I want to point out is that looking at, even using the words employment loss is very misleading. It's really loss of aggregate work hours, and especially in a low-wage market where it's easily demonstrated. But back to what Michael said, it got to start with Peoria, Doringer, and all that. That was all about the low-wage labor market had high churn, high turnover among employers, high churn among low-wage workers. So it's very possible that people could be earning much higher annual wages and working fewer weeks a year. They could be earning higher weekly wages, earning fewer, with less weekly hours. It's not such a bad thing. They could be working less than 2 jobs and still earn the same weekly wage. And it's also possible they could be thoroughly disemployed. We don't know. We don't have the empirical work to draw on. But I don't think we should buy into employment loss as the litmus test, the metric. I think we have to talk about, we should get rid of the words employment loss. We need to do aggregate hours reductions and think differently. Thank you very much.
So I think this question is probably going to be more relevant for Michael and Claire, but I'd be interested in Ken's response as well. With these increases, what do we expect in terms of wage gaps by race and even by gender? If it's the case that, on the bottom end, you're much more likely to have blacks and Latinos, you raise the bottom end, one imagines a reduction in that gap. To what extent have you looked at this? What does this reduction look like, assuming that it exists? Is there an employment story there as well? Can you think about the impact that this has on other aspects, other types of inequalities that we care about? And I start with Michael because I know that you have studied racial inequality, at least in the past. Let's bring it back.
Every study of who would be affected by minimum wage increases show that it's disproportionately female and disproportionately minority. So there's no question that it would close those disparities. We try to estimate those, Sylvia and I and Aaron, in our teen study, but I think we got into very small samples. But it definitely, when you look, that is to look at the employment effects by minority status or gender, but it's definitely clear that those who are gaining are disproportionately those for whom there's a wage gap.
Just say, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was I don't know if Ian does sitting back there, but it was a very high percent of the share of workers who would benefit who are people of color. At least in California, very heavily disproportionately Latino was really not surprisingly driving it.
yeah, overall, it's more than half of the affected workforce that is Black or Latino or Asian in California and New York State. But it's true that we do not have conducted simulations of the employment impacts by race. We're just able to identify who would benefit from the pay raises by race and gender.
And at this point, no sense about how much of a reduction in the gap are we going to count?
No, we haven't calculated that, but it would be interesting to do that.
That's pretty straightforward.
It's on the list. It's on the to-do list, definitely, yeah.
And there's actually a paper that shows how much of the gender wage gap it closes. But I had two sort of points. One is when, Claire, when you look at the high minimum wage of the U.S. in the 60s, and I wish people would, sort of back up, right? The $15 is out of bounds in terms of a wage increase. It's not out of bounds in terms of the history of the minimum wage. So we have had much higher minimum wages, and in the 60s, and the reason why economists look at teenagers is because prior to our new experiment started in the 80s that we wouldn't have a minimum wage, a way large proportion of those people were teenagers. So the more curious question is, over time, with essentially no minimum wage, we have, in most of the studies, right, the people who make below 15, the points you're now talking about, are older. Immigrants are far more important than teenagers as a share of the minimum wage workforce. Teenagers are just irrelevant today. But they are almost all high school graduates. A very high share of them even have associate's degrees. It's very hard to explain how it is that with technology complementing even low-wage workers, and with them having higher education and higher skills, we are discussing a $15 minimum wage that affects far better educated workers than was true in the 60s. So I think that has to be incorporated in thinking through, what does this really mean? When the U.S. had a higher minimum wage, the minimum wage workers actually looked like what we think minimum wage workers ought to look like. Teenagers, very low-skilled people, very poorly educated people. That's what they look like. They don't look like that today. That's a huge part of what has to be discussed. That's a huge conundrum. I would encourage, Michael, that when you do the simulation, it's not just aggregate demand, which is important, but the other thing is looking at distribution, not because there are different average propensities to consume, but the big problem we have had because the bottom has been stagnant, there isn't the growth of income at the bottom, and that gets to new firm formation. Distribution matters because if you have only people at the top 10% gaining income, you only have 10% new potential customers. If everybody's income is going up, you got 100% potential new customers. And for new firm formation, it's customer creation that matters. At the very low end, it's like the very high end. This is just depth to consumption. So at the very high end, they just spend a lot more money. They're not really new customers. And at the very low end, they're fulfilling unmet needs. So they go to the grocery store, but now they can actually fill their grocery cart. So there's that marginal propensity, but you seem to shy away from the wife who's working, and now that middle-class family actually gets a raise because the man's wage has been flat. They now become new customers. And they aren't just deepening on demand, they're actually new demand. So I think you want to add a dynamism that actually what you get is new firm formation. For the period up through the 70s, when we did increase wages at the bottom and everybody's wages went up, we had much higher new firm formation than since we have pulled that apart. And new firm formation has been declining with that breakup of everybody's incomes going up. And during this recovery, we only got new firm formation to go up when finally the bottom 80% started benefiting from this recovery. So it's only around 2011, 2012, when the bottom 80% started showing income growth, that we saw new firm formation pick up during this expansion. So I hope you will incorporate that part, not just the aggregate demand part.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, this question is, first of all, great studies, thank you. This question is for Claire Montialoux from Claire Brown in Economics. So my big concern is actually doing more work about rural areas versus urban areas. Fresno's a nice example, and Mississippi's one example, but I think the rural distinction is really important, and maybe we all realize that now politically. I looked at rural areas a long time ago just with unemployment insurance, and people in rural areas have a much lower cost of living for two reasons. One's housing, but much more than that, they don't spend much money. They don't have much money, they don't spend it. And so they just have a much lower standard of living, but that's their norm. And so my concern is with this federal minimum wage that, as you point out, it's like over half of the people in these rural areas might be directly or indirectly affected. And so my concern, as Larry Mishel pointed out, if you reduce turnover, you actually might cause some problems with people actually having access to the labor market. They already have really high unemployment rates. They have low participation rates. And so it seems to me that the disconnection in the rural areas could be even greater than you're finding, or even given that also you have a lot of assumptions that may not actually work in rural America today. You may end up with a lot more off-the-books employment because the payback is so high to pay off the books now. It may cause more, a more immigration versus native problem. So, Claire, I hope that you can think about how can you incorporate looking really carefully at rural America with the federal minimum wage and how it might actually impact how the labor market works there.
Any responses before we break for lunch?
Maybe I'll respond quickly on the first question about how difficult it is to infer anything on the high minimum wages today compared to what happened in the past. I think it's a very good point that the profiles of the low-wage workers are very different. Just to point out that the very preliminary graphs that I presented were for prime-age workers, leaving out teenagers, and I presented graphs for the bottom 50 of the distribution. So, of course, it will be critical to ask this question in this project, and thank you for pointing that out. For the question from Claire Brown, of course, you're also right that rural areas are very different from urban ones, and this has been a concern in our studies at the federal level with the case study we did on Mississippi and for Fresno, and we certainly want to do more work on that. The thing that we've been able to do is to look at the heterogeneity of the employment effects across sectors, and it's certainly true that in the case of Fresno, a $15 minimum wage would move things around a lot for the agricultural industry, for example. So we are still working on this distributional impact across industries, but I agree there would be much more to do and to be very thoughtful about.
Okay, Bill Spriggs' questions, the reality, not the reality, the data show that there are lots of new business entries when the minimum wage goes up. There are also more business exits. So, and the exits are different. Obviously, there are the weaker firms. The newer firms that come in are operating with a stronger business model. So I couldn't agree more that a higher minimum wage seems to show positive effects on new businesses. When we look at the aggregate demand question, we're not just saying, oh, it's 144 billion and let's multiply that by some multiplier. We're translating that first into family income and then looking at 9 different household income bins. So we're very much concerned with how that affects aggregate demand through the propensities to consume of these different income bins. So I think there's more to it than just an aggregate multiplier number. On Emmanuel's points about labor shares, tradables, and the CBO, the labor you have to recognize that the minimum wage has only a very partial effect, a very small effect for most of the economy. And so the fact that labor is 75% of value added as a whole is irrelevant because that's not most of those sectors aren't being affected in any appreciable way. So in the national study, we actually looked at where prices would go up and added the indirect effect of input price increases on overall price increases. And it really only went up appreciably enough in agriculture and in food manufacturing. After that is like not worth calculating. So, and in those sectors, the labor share was 20, around that 22%. The tradables question we also looked at, and again, it's agriculture and food manufacturing, and there is a concern. Will fruits and vegetables that are grown in California be replaced by fruits and vegetables that are grown in Mexico, or somewhere in Latin America, South America? But again, the wages actually in agriculture are surprisingly high, that more than you'd expect. And when you look at the price elasticity of demand for the fruits and vegetables, say for strawberries, well, California has a monopoly practically on strawberries, except for some times of the year, and also on fresh tomatoes. When you work out the numbers, it just doesn't seem like that we're going to lose our competitiveness on these seasonal fruits and vegetables. We could, and I think that's a big area where we're a little unsure. But I think it's not as big a problem as I thought it was when we started, and that's because most of the economy is not tradables, and most of the low-wage jobs are not in tradables. So, that translation doesn't quite get across. On the CBO, CBO had an advisory committee for the 2014 minimum wage study, and it had people like Bill Washer was on it, who was an opponent, and I think Larry Katz might have been on it, or Alan Kruger, one of the two, or both. So yeah, they take some academic advice, but they really just averaged the previous studies, and I think hopefully our local studies, and even more so the bunching paper, is really going to give them a different baseline, because they kind of guessed what the effect would be on all low-wage workers, extrapolating from teen studies or restaurant studies. And now we have estimates from all low-wage workers, so it's going to be, hopefully it'll be a big effect. But I agree we should be in dialogue with them.
Okay, let's thank everyone for presenting this morning.